I think we have enough in here now. So we'll go ahead and resume our programming. I want to introduce Subbu Vincent, our Director of Journalism and Media Ethics. He will introduce his panel, but as I mentioned, it's about human dignity framing, and I'm looking forward to this and starting off for the rest of the day until we get to the end of the day when we actually are going to have hopefully some key takeaways. What can we do both as individuals and as communities to be able to maintain human dignity and understand what that really means? And here's where is the place where we're going to get started. So Subbu, thank you.
Thank you, Thor. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session where we will take off from where Shannon left us off, saying, let us begin. And this will hopefully be one of those beginnings. I run media ethics at the center, and my work intersects with both news organizations and storytellers as one group of content producers, if you will, story producers, all the way to distribution platforms where social media companies and search and internet companies are distributing the news. In that area, we run into a lot of questions about how are algorithms really, quote unquote, understanding what's in the news. And that partly led me to wonder about many questions that have to do with framing. So in this particular area, we're going to talk about dignity itself and how is the word dignity and its meanings, how are they used in framing conversations, especially tough conversations, and is there a way we can reclaim what is actually decoded humanity, as she said. And to actually speak about that, I thought we'll bring people who have been looking at this in different ways, both in their own journeys at work, also just how they've lived their lives in different angles. So I'm going to ask all of our folks to introduce themselves. I'll just briefly mention, we have on my left Jane Pack, who is from Refugee and actually Immigrant. Transition, so we call it RIT, right? And just the word refugees has a sense in America where we are today. She'll have, I don't have to explain all of that to you. And on her left is Greg Eskridge, who is the host of the podcast Uncuffed. If you're listening to 91.7 FM, this is a local news organization I'm on the board of. He hosts that. He's not just the host of it, but he actually co-founded it when he was incarcerated, and he's had a long journey out of prison since then. And he helps other people in the podcast and through the podcast. And then we have Irina Raicu, my colleague, Internet Ethics Director at the center. If there's somebody who studied the connection between just the word privacy and all of its connotations on tech and internet and how it relates to actual human dignity, just as it plays out, it would be her. So I'm hoping she'll come into digital life and intersect that with all of the things we're going to hear. So I'm going to start with asking each of you folks to just introduce yourselves and tell a story from your lives, from work, that has to do with just the dignity word, its meaning as it applies to you. And if you can take a few minutes each, Jane, you go first, and then Greg, and then we'll go to Irina. And then after that, I've got a few questions for them both. And I would like to see if you folks have questions already that you've come with, because you saw the words on the headline, feel free to actually put them down now. We're not going to wait necessarily to the end of my questions. If I see cards coming in, I'd like to stop and see what you have to ask and relay them out and then continue along. So we don't have to wait for a full 45 minutes or so. We can get going even earlier with your Q&A. All right, thank you. So Jane, off to you, and we go from there.
Yes, good morning. It's still good morning, isn't it? I just want to start by thanking Subbu for the invitation. We were connected by a mutual colleague friend, Christina Azokar, and I'd love to bring her in the room. She's does some beautiful work in news media and journalism at San Francisco State University. And then maybe before I introduce myself, I want to reference our name, Refugee and Immigrant Transitions, because it is a name that many people stumble upon. And I want to mention it because I think there's a dignity framework here as well. We used to be called Refugee Transitions. And about 10 or so years ago, we had a lot of encouragement and push from our staff team to change our name to Refugee and Immigrant Transitions, recognizing the inequitable pathways to seek refuge in this country and the various ranges of people and statuses people were experiencing. So knowing that it was a harder name to pronounce and a harder name to recognize and remember, we felt that it was really important. So for those marketers in the room, we understand that it probably goes antithesis to sort of brand management and so forth, but it was something that was very important to us to be inclusive and recognize the full dignity of everyone in our communities. So my name is Jane Pack, and as mentioned, I'm the co-executive director at Refugee and Immigrant Transitions. I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of San Francisco in the Master of Migration Studies program, and I sit on the State Advisory Council holding a public seat for the California Department of Social Services Refugee Program Bureau. But more than all of that, the reason why I think I'm here is because I am an immigrant from the sovereign state of Canada, and still to be. And I am also a child of refugees. This is the biggest identity I hold and something I think about, reflect upon, and that really informs my way of being day in, day out. When I think of the word dignity, I think of so many things, but the story that comes to mind for me is that of my grandmother. We think a lot about the ancestral folks in our lives who have informed our ways of being. So my grandmother escaped North Korea when she was probably in her 20s with 5 kids under the age of 9. My father was 6 at the time, so he was responsible for carrying himself on foot, while the 9-year-old held the 1-year-old, and so on and so forth. Why I think of her when I think of dignity is because to her dying day, it was something that was central in her life. In fact, my father would say he was a refugee twice. The first time was when they escaped North Korea, sort of in a sneakily fashion where they were caught by police and had to run in the forest away from guards and along gunshots, all those typical stories that you hear. And the second time during the Korean War, where there were masses of people on the street. Where dignity comes in, not only in the life of my grandmother throughout all that, is when she lived in South Korea at that time. And she was basically a minister of the streets. She was not an ordained minister, but she was very committed to her faith and spent a lot of time working and being with people who were unhomed, unhoused. And even to the point where during the Korean War, when people died, she would collect dead bodies and bathe them and give them proper burials. Because even in death, should we have dignity? So that's a story I've told in many different places, but that to me is sort of a full recognition of dignity from life to death. So thank you. Pass it on to my good friend, Greg.
Thank you, Jane.
All right, thank you, Jane. Yes, my name is Greg Eskridge, and thank you, Subbu, for bringing me to this event. This is definitely a very personal topic, a word for me. Like Subbu alluded to, I am formerly incarcerated. I've been home now for 8 months after serving 30 years of incarceration. And when I think about dignity, I think about it as a word that we all may know the definitions, that dignity is about treating people with respect and fairness and compassion and kindness. However, my understanding of the word came from a lack of all of those things. Being inside of a place that's oppressive, a place that tells you that you are unworthy of being seen as a human being, you are isolated and you are degraded every single day for 30 years straight. And one begins to take on all of those, the idea that you are worthless. And for so long, I felt that I was worthless. And then something clicked inside of me and said that if I'm going to die in prison, I'm going to die with dignity, right? I'm going to cause all of these folks that are upholding these oppressive rules and these systems, I'm going to cause these people to see me as a human being. And I started to do that, and people started to see me as a human being. I go to Viktor Frankl once said that when you're unable to change your situations, you're then challenged to change yourself. And so I know I had to go within myself to change, so folks wouldn't see me just as inmate Eskridge K07041. They'll see me as a human being. And then I took it a little further and said, you know what? I'm not just satisfied with you treating me with dignity inside of this place. I'm going to get out of this place. I'm going to return to society and be a dignified person out in this world. And so my journey began, and my fight for dignity is what allowed me to sit in front of you all today in this space. So thank you. I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. So I now know that on this panel, Greg is the only one who's not an immigrant. The three of us, the other three are. I am an immigrant, and I came as a refugee with my family from what was then communist Romania. I now work in internet ethics, and when we talk about dignity, we talk about respect and honor and delicacy, and I know that when you hear your words, you immediately think internet, right? So I will come back to talk about all of the ways in which we haven't done a very good job at all of upholding dignity in the digital world. But to go back to my life experiences, I will say that if you live in a communist country, you have lots of occasions to miss dignity. You don't have freedom of speech, you don't have freedom to vote, you are, at least in the case of communist Romania, you were surveilled all the time, and so there was definitely, dignity is what happened in sort of the cracks between the various oppressive practices. But I will add another phase to that, which was my coming to California directly from communist Romania and going to high school here. And boy, if you want to feel your dignity slipping away, if you come and you look funny and you have a funny accent and you don't understand the cultural norms, and you are at that point where, you know, even Americans struggle to fit in, I think I experienced that sense of loss of dignity even more powerfully in that period of transition. If you are an immigrant and you switch countries and you switch codes and all of those things that we talked about, you have to find yourself again, and you have to find your dignity, and then you have to figure out how the dignity of others intersects with your own in interesting ways.
Thank you. You already got us going on the next question, Irina, so I'm going to put that slide up. So we've, I find that just the word dignity is used often in conjunction with all the other words you see there. We say dignity and freedom. We say dignity of work, which is a question Dr. Waller just answered about. And then we often bring it up in conjunction with other areas. For example, just storytelling. When do people tell their own stories to reclaim versus when do journalists tell their stories? So there's these things that happen all the time, but I wanted to ask, why is the dignity word always used in conjunction with all of the other things? So there must be something special about the word. So in that sense, I wanted to ask people that question. I wanted Jane, Greg, Irina to answer, why is it so easy? What can you say from your experiences? You've advocated for others, you've advocated for yourselves. So can you take that on and just share what you think about it, and then we'll go from there. Jane, you want to go first?
Oh, I thought you can go start with.
Okay. Let's go with Greg first, and then go with Irina and come back to Jane. Yeah.
So for me, it's thinking about in terms of storytelling, owning our own stories, being inside of San Quentin for so many years, and like I talked about, just being in this system that's geared to really strip you of your dignity, and get an opportunity to be in radio and tell our own stories was a way of reclaiming that dignity. It was a way of basically fighting back against this system, because there's one system that says we are this particular group of individuals who do not deserve to be treated as human beings, but then you have an opportunity to say, no, this is who I am as a person. This is my struggle. This is my triumph. This is my resiliency. This is who Greg is. This is who other incarcerated people are inside of these systems. And for me, the storytelling gave me the opportunity and other folks opportunity to be able to say to the world, no, see us for who we truly are, not for the narrative that's already been painted for us. And being home now for the past 8 months, I've been working with KOW, and I continue to do this important work of giving folks a platform, giving folks a microphone to be able to tell their own stories and share with the world and reclaim their own dignities.
So how did you manage to convince the people at San Quentin, given the oppressive system that there is, how did you manage to convince them that this is the direction you want to take? You started resisting and so on and so forth. Can you talk us through the journey there? Because there is another side to this. They actually did facilitate in making this kind of podcast happen and so on. At least they didn't stand in the way.
Yes. I don't think they really truly knew what was coming. I think it was an opportunity. I mean, and one thing I would just say, given the opportunity to share our stories, there was particular staff that had a progressive mindset that said that we wanted to give you all the opportunity to be able to show what change truly looks like. And so we were given this opportunity by staff that were forward thinking. And so all of the stories we tell are about humanity. We're not talking about bashing the system. We can sit here all day and talk about how horrible these systems are. We all know this, right? But that's not what it's about. We're not talking about the system itself. We're talking about the people who are inside of this place. And so, yes, they help facilitate starting the program. And also, I would say, our stories are filtered. Like they're censored. You just don't just get a chance to put a story together and send it out. They do have to listen to it and approve it. And so keeping that in mind, we have to make sure that we're always staying on point, staying on topic with just showing our humanity and showing our true rehabilitation. And as long as we've continued to do that, we have not had any hiccups.
Thank you. Irina, what's your sense of that?
Yeah, so I was thinking how fitting it is to hear Greg say that his podcast the whole point was about this is who Greg is, as told by Greg. Because one of the things you keep hearing about the internet is that these various platforms know you better than you know yourself, right? I'm sure you've heard that. And the only way you would believe that is if you think that humans are collections of data points. And if you know that we're more than that, then you understand that no, actually, Greg knows who Greg is in a way that no surveillance machine that tracks him and observes his behaviors, but not his internal states, like Shannon was talking about, actually conveys what that self-narrative can convey. So, but the internet is very much about collecting data. So I wanted to just flag a few points at which the internet, the digital world, fails us when it comes to human dignity. One of them is the whole issue of deepfakes, right, that we're seeing arising now with AI, where people can make fake images of others, including sexualized images, and it's absolutely, I mean, I don't need to explain how that undermines the dignity of the people involved. And this is happening now at scale, and it's happening with very young people. And it's a real problem. We haven't figured out what to do about that. There's the whole internet tracking that we've been hearing about for many, many years now. And it turns out that privacy absolutely supports human dignity. So when you undermine privacy, you are undermining human dignity broadly as well. There's the newer issue of the scraping of our own personal communications to be used as training data for the AI without our consent. Again, consent is one of those elements that's required for human dignity. So this is another way in which we're eroding human dignity online. There's the whole issue of bias, of stereotypical representations of people that also harms their dignity. If you generate images of women, a lot of them are going to be large-breasted women just because there are so many pictures of that kind on the internet that's overrepresented in the data. And so that becomes how women are seen. that is a degradation of human dignity if you reduce entire populations to stereotypes just because you don't have the right kind of data in the system. And then it's interesting, you mentioned, Jane, the whole idea of the dignity of the dead. We now see these efforts to reanimate, they call it, the dead, including loved ones, right? The idea is that we never have to let go. Instead of this notion that one of the shared experiences that we share as humans is that life ends, we're now trying to kind of counter that with these simulacra of our loved ones. That impacts both the dignity of the dead and the dignity of the living in the interactions with those tools. And at the same time, and this is a big thing, and so I don't want to be saying that, you know, the internet is just all bad for human dignity. It is absolutely the platform that has given people the ability to tell their stories and to express their voices. At least for a good amount of time, until most governments realized that that's what was happening on the internet, and then they started to take all kinds of measures to prevent that. But it still is one of the means by which this can happen, and that is extremely powerful and extremely supportive of human dignity and allowing people to connect with each other and to be curious about things that they couldn't find out about in their own immediate communities. That is a very powerful dignity-supporting function of the internet.
Thank you. You actually ended on a positive note about the internet.
I tried. No, I do believe all of those things are true.
Right, and then they can all be true at the same time. Jane, can you connect the dots there as you see fit in terms of just going back to the power of the meaning of the word? These other words I see there, freedom, storytelling, digital life, work, and so on, they're all areas where contestations are playing out. Like freedom is contested, taken away at will. And then Dr. Waller actually said dignity is actually contested too. So I felt somehow dignity is a unifying, cherished ideal, and maybe that's not so contestable, and that's why it's so common across all the board, across all the other experiences. So where do you come in on that?
I thought I would get off easy by going third, but now you dropped that one on me. Well, there's a lot in there, and I think when I think of the words on the screen, the things that I was reflecting on coming here was freedom and storytelling, and how they interact with one another and how they speak to one another. And then I love the duality of the internet being sort of the stripping of dignity, but also the opportunity to share dignity and connect over dignity, if I'm not misinterpreting. Maybe I can start there while the back of my head thinks about your second question. When I think about freedoms and dignity, you know, we think a lot about freedom of speech in this day and age, right? Freedom of religion, freedom of thought, and all these things that are being violated right as we sit in this room. Something that really kind of came to me as I was ruminating on this is just the freedom to be. We live in a world where, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next question, is like we disaggregate things to such itty bitty bits that we forget that we just want to be. We want to be human. We want to live our lives. We want to take our kids to school without the fear of being pulled over, without the fear of being carded or ID'd because of the color of our skin, without the fear of losing our loved ones because they walked a funny way, or they spoke a different way, or they ate a different way. And I kind of want to me, that's almost the antithesis of the coding of, you know, what we're talking about in this day and age. It's the fullness of just being. So I want to tie that to storytelling, because storytelling is something that we're trying to do and have been trying to do for a long time at Refugee and Immigrant Transitions. We've tried different things. It's something I honestly, personally struggle with, because I've seen it done in such harmful ways. And I've experienced personally it done in such harmful ways, where a story is shared in trusted fashion, you know, putting ourselves out in vulnerable fashion, for our stories to be misinterpreted, which understandably, we all interpret things a different way, but then resynthesized and put out in a different form. Another thing I struggle with in terms of storytelling is often it's stripped down to that disaggregated bit. As Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talks about the danger of a single story. We hear the single narrative over and over and over and over again. Before we know it, it's embedded in our minds that all refugees are victims, all immigrants are villains, so on and so forth. How do we complicate these spaces to remember that we're actually our full selves? How do we give space to have long-form podcasts and conversations so that we can see that we all make mistakes, we all have happy moments, we all express pain and joy and so forth? How do we do that in a way that shows and respects the full dignity of all? At RIT, before we were RIT, when there were only 2 people that worked in the office, one fellow was a former refugee himself, has since passed, may you rest in peace. He used to say, we are not zoo animals. When they get calls from media, so thank you for the journalism, from media and outside actors who wanted to hear a story or speak to a refugee, he'd say, we're not zoo animals. And to this day, we still feel that. And I think, like, recently we've been engaging over the last number of years with wonderful, journalists and so forth who understand sort of the nuances and so forth, and yet also still have a timeline and have to extract a particular story that's directly tied. And I'm thinking specifically about, you may hear it was in the New York Times, I think yesterday, it was on Democracy Now! Today, of a Nepali-speaking ethnic Nepali Bhutanese who came here as refugees 20 years ago, and are now being identified and deported into a country where they don't have citizenship anymore because they were expelled from Bhutan, who are sent to India and Nepal and between places in prisons, and where family members here are still trying to find their loved ones because under this new administration or this returning administration, they've been deported without due process. So I bring that into the storytelling arm because it's something that I've been having conversations with that particular community. And actually we connected through mutual friends around this about how do you tell these nuanced stories and still protect the dignity of not only individual stories, but like collective stories and the safety of people to come back home and stay home. So that was sort of a little bit all over the place, but I think storytelling is so powerful and can be so harmful, but when done right, and I've said this to Greg, when done right can be so humanizing. And I said this, it's been a really painful time for our communities. I'm sitting here with such a heavy heart. I'm trying not to cry. It's so hard what's going on right now for our staff, for our family members, for our community members, for our students, for our clients. And so when I try to look for my own sort of strength, I go to places where things are whole, where I feel the true essence of humanity. And I'm not just saying this, I truly, truly mean this. I feel that in your podcast, because I feel humanity, right? And I hear vulnerability. I hear, just hope. I hear so many positive things. How can we do that in our storytelling to never forget the human dignity inside? And even if that means pushing out on a deadline, which I know is hard in media.
Thank you for that. That was beautiful. Thank you.
That was beautiful. So actually, this allows me a chance to connect what Irina said about the good side of online, of just internet technology, and what Greg and Jane just said. So I'm going to ask a pointed question to you, Greg. In journalism, the assumption has always been that reporters will come in and tell the stories of the people in the reality they're actually covering. So they'll interview people, they'll talk to a bunch of people, they'll dig up a bunch of documents, and then they'll report out a story. So in a way, it's an indirect story. So I call it journalistic speech. It's the speech of other people along with other insights they want to include, and then that goes out as a story. Now, I have felt of late that for people in particular vulnerable situations, people who have experienced a lot of vulnerability, imprisonment, oppression, and this, that, and the other, is dignity the line where you say, no, this is not where reporters should go in and tell stories of others. They have to tell their own story, and that's because it's easier today anyway on the internet for people to tell their own story through their own podcast, through their own YouTube videos, and so on. Can you respond to that? You're in a media organization that actually could have gone into San Quentin and said, we'll report out a story of how people are rehabilitating themselves, how they're going to transition out, what are they doing after transition. It could have been a classic journalistic series. But no. You are actually people telling your own stories inside, and as you as you come outside. Where did you take that decision? Because that is not a common decision to take.
Not at all. Thank you for that question. And so it's so interesting you say that because that's exactly what happened. In around 2012, when journalists wanted to come inside of San Quentin, they wanted to just come in, like you say, interview a few people, go back out and tell the stories that they wanted to shape. And so a lot of individuals said, we're tired of that skewed view, that negative narrative that was only causing harm to people. We said to them, like, no, we want to tell our own stories. How about you come into the prison, give us the computers, and teach us how to edit, to tell stories, and how to produce. And we'll produce our own stories. It's like Irina alluded to, like, who can tell Greg's story better than Greg? Nobody, right? And so given that opportunity, we took it because there were so many instances where you would see the media come in and they would portray prisoners as these horrible monsters, right? Now I know some amazing people inside of these places that committed crimes during horrible times of their lives. I make no excuses for it. I take full responsibility for the crime I committed and for others as well. However, does a 5-second bad decision determine Greg's entire 51 years on this planet? It should not. And so getting an opportunity to tell that story and to tell the story of how Greg got to a point to where he committed a crime in the first place and how Greg changed his life and became a rehabilitated human being that was ready to get back out in society and be productive. This is what we wanted to do, and we were not going to go for anything less than that because we know the power of the truth. And there's truth inside of the people, but you have to let the people tell their own stories.
There's truth inside of people. That itself is a frame that combination of words is not heard that often. So thank you for just bringing that up. I'm going to go back to Irina here. You started this off on the positive side of the internet, so I'm not letting you go. So when people are telling their own stories, they become public. They become known names. Greg is now a known name and face online. When women tell their own stories, I've had women academics saying they don't want to get quoted in the news because they get attacked the next day on Twitter or X. So there's all kinds of trolling that happens once a name surfaces on the internet. In your sense, can you respond to what Greg said about the costs of storytelling, authentic storytelling online, where we reclaim our dignity and we say we have the truth for ourselves? What are the responsibilities on the net, on distribution systems, on platforms that have your data and use this as data? And then are there other things you see that can help this kind of authenticity play out? Or do you feel that, no, that's where the negative side comes in and this is all going to be abused again?
I mean, the fact that, anybody can reach anybody these days is both a good and a bad thing. And if you study privacy online for many years, and then you are expected to do things like talk to the media, as I am, there's such a tension. You so don't want to put yourself out there in any way or draw anybody's attention to you. On one hand, we say that we want people to tell their stories, and on another, we've kind of accepted or been conditioned to a world in which they will then immediately be attacked, either from people who misunderstand or from people who just feel like they can, they can express their opinions without understanding the way in which they can really hurt another human being. So we haven't done a very good job. I talk a lot about the need for AI literacy, but before that we used to talk about the need for media literacy and the need for digital literacy in general. And one of the aspects that we still have not inculcated in people is to understand that even though you're typing something on a computer, behind that screen you are reaching these, flesh human beings with all of the pain that you can cause. So I think there's a lot that platforms can do. I think there's a lot that all of us can do individually to kind of, check ourselves in some of the impulses that have been developed over time from these kind of interactions. It's absolutely a dual-edged sword, and I think that's where the idea of some control and consent becomes really important, because if you're a victim of domestic violence who's been tracked online, and that's actually one of the great harms that we're seeing, it might be wonderful for you to tell your story, but you probably don't want to, and you're not going to, and nobody should make you, because that balancing of benefits and harms tilts a certain way. So it's about giving people the control whether they want to tell their story or not, and then how to tell their story. And I wanted to say one more thing about, you talked about the word dignity and how we've been talking about how it's contested. My background is in literature and law, and if there's one thing you get from that background is that words are contested, language is contested. That's just how all of this works. And the fact that you don't have a clear consensual that everybody has agreed on definition for anything doesn't mean it's not important. We used to talk about the fact that nobody can define what privacy is. So nobody can define what freedom is. Nobody can define, we know somewhere deep in our human selves what those things mean. And they probably mean slightly different things for each of us. But yeah, when you say, Subbu, your sense is that even though there's all this contestation, when we say dignity, we all kind of understand what that means, right? And it goes to thinking of, Greg as a full human being, and it goes to thinking of refugees as something other than just refugees. That kind of fullness and appreciation for the fullness of another human being is, I think, what dignity is.
Thank you. Do you both want to weigh in on that before I toss it out for questions? I saw...
Here.
Do you want to add anything, Greg? I saw you nodding.
Yeah, but there's so much, but I would just say that, when you think about dignity, I'm going to probably say something that's probably going to blow everybody away because it's so simple, but to me, it's just about treating people the way you want to be treated. It's about just having human kindness, having compassion for people, seeing people, valuing people, respecting people, understanding people, suspending judgment for people, and just seeing people as worthy as people, full human beings. I know that probably blew everybody away, but it's so simple.
I just paused to let the word sit.
Yeah.
For some time. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I'm sitting with this as well, and I think sometimes we do need to kind of go back to the foundations of who we are. I didn't answer the previous question about contestation, and there's a reason why I sit and in these liminal spaces trying to bridge like academia, community praxis, and advocacy. It's because sometimes we get stuck in our ways of kind of disaggregating and analyzing and so on and so forth, and sometimes we just have to, like I said at the beginning, just be, right? If we're just being with one another, sometimes that dignity will sort of form. So I love the simplicity of it, because I think we are at a time where we, overanalyze at times, and can we just be with one another? I think that's what the society needs at this point, is we're so fractured right now.
So I'm going to just ask for a second for you folks to send notes up here. Yeah, questions before I move to another segment. Thank you very much, Thor. So 2 questions came in. All right. Individualism versus society. Do you think that we care more about the dignity of ourselves, individualism in brackets, rather than the dignity of all of us, society? So there's a dichotomy being posed to you there. So that's one. Would one of you want to take it? This is about caring about ourselves versus...
Yeah, can I suggest that there's a third layer that lately we seem to care about sort of a kind of a tribal dignity. So not so much the individual, but not at the broader societal level, but particular sub-communities that we cling to, that we feel represent somehow an aspect of our identity that needs special protection. And so I think in that, so for example, some of the people who are now very, I don't know if they're willing to accept all the cruelty around, immigration law enforcement, but they would probably say that they're upholding somehow the dignity of the nation, right? The people who came here legally, the right way, all of those things. So I think there's this this weird tension between like where you allocate the dignity, and to me, the dignity goes back to the individual. I think the social is what supports the individual dignity if we do it right. I think. And I'm just throwing things out there because I haven't thought about this long and hard, but where I would say I see a kind of a social dignity is when we talk about the environmental aspects that, as Shannon mentioned, are not discussed enough. And there, the fact that we're destroying the entire planet does impact the dignity of every human being and every other living thing on this planet. But otherwise, I think we are better off talking about the dignity of individuals and the way in which communities can help that or hurt that.
Thank you. Do you want to jump in on that, Jane or Greg?
I have notes for the next question. It really actually hits directly on this, so I'll be silent for the next question. I think this is a really significant issue, and I'm going to give away your next question if you don't mind, in a form of free flow, organic. Yeah, it's just how do you use the word dignity, and how do you frame it in your work? And I'll enter through this, and then I'll get to the question. I think the way we've done it at RIT is we sometimes start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is very much an individualistically based document. It's the rights of individuals. But I just want to read the first line of the preamble. It says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of peace, freedom, justice, and peace in the world. This is how we start, because I think the UDHR is an international document that many people are familiar with. It's an aspirational document. It's not encoded in law necessarily unless it's been adopted into some sort of a convention of some sort. But that being said, when we introduced this last year, we did what's called, we called it a conversation series. We had a number of conversations. We invited everybody in our community to just come and just have a conversation about the framing of our work right now. We started off with rights. We juxtaposed it to realities, and then to responsibilities. And that, to me, is somewhat of a continuum, if you will, or some sort of like an interplay between the individual and the communal or the collective. And so in terms of the rights versus realities, we, of course, highlighted the many rights that are being violated, on persons and communities. Refugees and immigrants in particular. But then we really started talking about responsibilities. Sometimes, and I'm going to take this in a little bit different sort of avenue if I can, is that we're so focused on our individual rights, we forget about our responsibilities to one or another. And I loved when I walked into the room, I heard the word responsibility, and I've heard it kind of come up in more ways than I have in many other settings. Right now, we've lost our responsibility to one another, to other humankinds, to whether it's for dignity or for whatever the case is. And this, if I can go into a little bit more depth, is where some of my research goes, is really understanding and kind of unpacking this individual and what I would say the hyper-individual in this neoliberal society, where we disaggregate people or communities into these measurable bits. We disaggregate human beings into their single stories, into impact measures in funding, in funding conversations with nonprofits that really take away the look at the entire person, but just looks at the graduation rate, for example. But knowing that if you're immigrating or you're fleeing a country and coming to the United States in high school, it's not reasonable to graduate in 4 years. When you're learning a language, you've got 7 years of missed formal schooling, and you might be unhoused or housing unstable and food insecure, right? But these are the standards we're holding people to. So when we disaggregate things, sometimes we forget the larger context, right? So I want to juxtapose that to some research with some amazing community members, friends, and thought partners. And we've framed ourselves as community leader scholars with refugee experiences because we didn't want to label ourselves as refugee scholars or, that. So community leader scholars, coalesce, like the word coalesce is what we call ourselves. But the idea that many of us come from collective backgrounds. One where a dear friend, Jean-Pierre Mana would say, where like tea and sugar are inseparable. We care for one another in ways that are not understood necessarily in dominant Western hegemony, where we practice its disaggregating neoliberal practice. Where can we kind of bring dignity back into the spaces of the collective, of the communal survival, the communal thriving in ways that we are responsible for one another, we hold share accountability and care for one another, and we don't even see, we see the individual, but we're also the collective. Does that make sense? And that's something that I've been writing more and more about with my colleagues and friends, because it feels like that's an underlying conversation that's not had. And in the meantime, when you talk to folks from these communal backgrounds, they're felt stripped of their dignity. They're seen, feel invisible, because they're only seen as their one slice versus the part of themselves that is connected to others. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you for upstaging my next question,
Whoever that was.
And it kind of, actually, I see echoes in this of what Shannon ended with. There's the idea of the collective in the sense of shared responsibility, but also you're particularly hitting back at the costs of disaggregation. The minute you decompose something, people and their traits and all of that into parts, we've lost sense of the whole. And I see that in journalistic storytelling as well, because there's a disaggregation of what reporters want to do, on how they want to tell these stories in a piecemeal way. And in ethics, the call is to try to have the story represent the whole, where the union is greater than the sum of the parts. So I'm glad you've echoed that back.
Can I say something though, Subbu? As
Yes,
you're saying
Irina.
that, I'm thinking, but there are different kinds of story, and definitely in journalism. I mean, there's a reason why we don't have, we no longer have official newspapers, almost, I guess. But you didn't have a newspaper that was all stories about people telling their own story, right? Because there are other reasons for doing journalism, like to present facts, like to help people understand a societal issue, not a particular individual story. And in that sense, I go back to what Jane was saying about how sometimes you tell your story and it can get misrepresented and repackaged in such a way. And so the whole issue of misinformation and disinformation online comes up, right? Where people might be telling their own stories, and then suddenly 20 seconds from the telling of a story becomes its own story. And so I guess that goes to a sort of societal level of dignity. I think we lose in a society that's rife with misinformation and disinformation. There's a different kind of loss of dignity there too, just in being lied to and misinformed, and then expected to make, ethical decisions as a human being based on these fabricated, non-facts.
Thank you. There's another question. I mean, would you like to jump in, Greg, or can I go to another question that came in?
Oh, no, go ahead. No, okay.
So how do you hold to your dignity as an immigrant in this political climate? And how do you impart this to other immigrants who are in transition? So I'm going to ask the transition leader here to answer that first.
Can you ask the question again? Sorry.
How do you hold on to your dignity as an immigrant in this political climate? And how do you impart this to other immigrants who are in transition? Maybe those who came in recently, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. I think context really matters, of course. As mentioned, I'm an immigrant from the sovereign nation of Canada. I came in through a pretty easy path. I came in through an F1 international student visa to attend grad school. I had a very easy transition to a corporation that gave me, I started off in business, an H-1B, and then eventually another visa, and then another visa, and then eventually a green card. And then eventually I naturalized as a citizen. I think it's recognizing those different sort of pathways, as well as our different positionalities and responsibilities once we have sort of a window into the inequitable systems that exist. How do I hold on to my own dignity is, I think, such an interesting question. Allowing myself to be my full self. I think sometimes we enter places where we're more filtered than other places. And of course, sometimes I'll follow that protocol, but like more than not, I do feel like at many times that I have nothing to lose at this point. I'm so grateful to have, although I'm not sure if my citizenship is secure, but I do think worst case, I go back to the sovereign nation of Canada, right? But I think I was reading snippets of the letters from Birmingham from Martin Luther King Jr., and I think it was the third section of what are you willing to lose, right? Like if we are going to look ourselves in a collective fashion, how do I sort of see myself in my full self and my responsibility and prepare myself for what are you willing to lose when you know that so many other people are in such more precarious situations. So how do you extend that? I think is really doing everything you can. Right now, for example, it's just horrendous. I don't know how closely you're following the news. Like just people who've come to this country after the U.S. has imposed harm and war and promised safe haven, receiving 7-day notices to leave the country and go back to Afghanistan. For people who came through the Unite for Ukraine program and parole program and are told that their paroles are going to be revoked, and having caseworkers and staff members from all over the world and knowing that this is affecting them directly and their families, how do you extend this? Is to do everything we can to learn the systems and extend the systems and advocate for change of systems so we are aware of the inequities so we can make things more whole and better. But I'd love to share a more simple story, if I may. We're an educational nonprofit organization. We provide education to adults, English language, to bridge language divides and language barriers, and really inform by language justice. We have programs in schools and so on and so forth. But one of our programs is a VESSEL program, Vocational English for Speakers of Other Languages. And I sat in one of our teachers' classes the other day, Jackie, who's just absolutely brilliant, beautiful pedagogue and just wonderful human being. And the lesson of the day was on some of the 7 question words: who, what, where, when, why, how. And that particular day, she was looking at where. This is one of our most diverse classes. We have sometimes, women only, women identified only classes, Dari Pashto classes, Spanish or Mom classes, and bilingual classes. This one is a very diverse class. And the question was where? Where is your water bottle? Where are your glasses? Where do you work? Where are you from? Which we don't ask people on the street, by the way, but in this particular context was completely relevant. And somebody went up and said, I'm from Eritrea, and pointed to a map that she had put on the screen. The next person went up and said, I'm from Yemen. Oh, look, we're really close to Eritrea. Next person went up, next person went, next person went up. These were people from Yemen, Afghanistan, Cuba, Haiti, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, so on and so forth. I know I'm forgetting, and multigender. And then the man from Eritrea went up and he shared a story about his own family and background. He did what we do in our graduate programs, a migration share. And he talked about the sociopolitical climate. He talked about this various other things. And by the middle of it, people are asking each other questions. How many languages in your country? How many religions in your country? How many people in your country? And by the end of the story, at the end of his story, he shared about his family. He said, this is my mother, this is my father, showed pictures. These are my 4 children, their ages, their hobbies. And then he said, but they're all still in Eritrea. I have no family here, I'm alone. And a man from Afghanistan spoke up and said, we're your family here now. Mm-hmm. How do you create dignified spaces, and how do you extend that to other immigrants in transition to show and carve space through pedagogy, through love, through care, through the shared journey, diverse experiences of transitioning while also being from different backgrounds, to showing that we are human, this is part of the process, and we're going to be there for one another. I think that for our organization, it's not just about language classes. It's an introduction of what democracy and peace can be, so that when people go back to their communities or 10 years down the road, they're teaching a class or whatever the case may be, they remember dignity, how they were treated, what is possible, and their responsibility for continuing that. And many come having been leaders in their various communities. So I hope I answered your question, but it, to me, is hope. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Can I ask you, just because the question was framed toward immigrants, but Greg came out after 30 years into what must have been a very different world than when you went in. So when you want to talk about transition and how you support people going through transitions, that seems like a relevant question.
I was going there and you took it.
Sorry.
Awesome.
Sorry.
Greg, when you answer that question that Irina beautifully asked you, can you also talk about the collective sense you had when you were inside San Quentin with other folks who were producing podcasts with you?
So let me just start off. Thank you, Jane. I love that you ended with hope, because hope is absolutely necessary. And without hope, you will not gain anything. And so thank you for using that word, hope. Let me just say, like I said before, I spent 30 years in prison. I had so many different ideas of what the world was going to be when I got out. I fought tooth and nail to get out into a society. And when I finally got here, I'll be honest with you all, I looked around the world and I said to myself, is this it? Is this what I've been kicking and scratching and fighting to get to? The divisiveness, the same oppressive state that this world seems to have always been in, just in different layers. And so just thinking about being a beacon of hope for other folks, when people inside of these places are going to the parole board and trying to get out of prison, everyone on the yard knows the day that everyone is going to go. And regardless if you know this person or not, everyone is saying, good luck, you got this. We know you're going to do good in there. We know you're going to get a chance to get out of their place. And so when I walked in, there was the same scenario. And I got found suitable and I was released. And coming out into this world, the beauty of it, the ugliness of it, it's all there. It was there when I went in 1994. It was just a little different back then. And so that transition is about hope, is about being in a situation to where people are hopeless and helpless and they see somebody else make it through a situation. And regardless if you are an immigrant and you're coming to this country and you see somebody else doing well, or you see someone struggle, you see someone's adversity and that they overcome it, it tells you that you are capable of doing the exact same thing that they did as well. And so for me, it's more about seeing human beings, like changing conversations and communicating with people and seeing people as more than transactional, but seeing people as more transformational. And I continue to give back because I know I saw people before me walk out and come into this world and be successful and be pillars of their community. And so I sit here before you today as hopefully as a lighthouse for all those ships that are cast away in the sea, giving them something to see, a beacon to where they can go to.
Thank you. So I'm going to beacon. I'm going to merge two questions into one, and I'm also going to remind you folks that it's about 15 minutes to end. We'll also start wrapping about 5 minutes before so that they can have some time for closing views as well. So if there are any other cards you want to send, please give it to Thor. This is last call for question cards. I'm going to ask And Jane already got into this, how she uses the word to frame communications itself. But I'm going to merge this with the more contested one, which I feel I don't have a handle on, so I thought I'll toss it up here. You folks can look at these two and see whether you want to add this into your notes. How do we avoid the word, just the word dignity in becoming a catch-all or a go-to term to just resolve or reframe when you're actually having a conflict and you feel like that's a catch-all word, let's just use this and we'll see if we can dissolve the kind of dispute that there is, and so on. So there is a moral force for the word, as you've seen here, but also other limits to where we are not going to be able to move the needle forward at all. So that I wanted you folks to reflect on that. So who wants to get that off the ground? And in actually answering that, if you can come back to also examples where you've had to deal with that when you were communicating out to your teams, to people, to organizations, to advocate for a cause, to raise money for a cause, and so on. In all those areas, if you ran into both the limits of the word itself, that would help to talk about. Is that such a complicated question?
Yes.
It seems like it.
I guess, so initial thoughts would be that I think a lot of these words can become catch-all words like freedom, like love. And I think we will make different decisions about, where we think they have the most moral force. I think it just plays out differently in different fields, and that we all use it. I would say I've used it. I haven't used it very much. I probably used it less than both my co-panelists, and I probably will use it more as a result of this day's conversations. But I was thinking, for example, I get to talk to engineering students who, and AI students who are going to design the next wave of technology that we were just talking about, and who often don't hear the word dignity come up in their classes. And for example, one thing I've been doing, we talked, or Shannon talked in her talk, or was asked about the dignity of labor. And one aspect that didn't come up is all the labor that goes into AI that's not done by developers or engineers. And what I've been doing over and over again is ask audiences like you to raise their hand if you've heard the name Sam Altman. Okay. How many of you have heard the term taskers? A lot fewer. So there's this great article called AI is a Lot of Work that talks about all of the different people around the world who are now doing this kind of like bit work, piece work, the way people used to do in their own home, that are the kind of work that goes into building these models that make a few people very rich, but whose whole work, this whole layer of hundreds of thousands of people, is just unknown. You can't have the dignity of work if people don't even understand that this work exists and that these systems could not be developed without it. But to go back for a second in terms of, again, where I think this can have moral force in my own context. So I made myself a t-shirt a while back that reads confounding variable. And, I like to think of myself as a confounding variable, but I was thinking more broadly about how human beings are the confounding variable. You are never going to capture all of the complexity of what we're talking about in terms of a full human being, no matter how many different data points you collect. And if I can get that through to engineering students, and really all students, not just engineering students, then I think maybe we'll have better systems and a better internet and a better, everything else that we're talking about. That in that sense, the whole point of dignity is that we value the full complexity and variations of individual human beings. And good societies are the ones that manage that complexity better than we are. And reducing things to simpler, collections of data points is not helping us get the good solutions that we want.
Thank you. I think it's good that you're taking it back to this fundamental problem we're having with tech-enabled societies of reducing ourselves to data. Shannon brought it up in her talk. Let me ask Greg and Jane, so where do you come in on, do you see any limits to using the word in your conversations? Have you felt hesitant that I shouldn't bring, the concept of dignity up here because it doesn't apply? Is there any, I'm just asking to see whether you felt it. I mean, you don't have to have felt it. You can say, no, it's fundamental, Subbu. What's the big deal with the question? So feel free to push back.
No, definitely. I love the word. I love what it means because I've been on both sides of it. Like I've experienced a lack of dignity, and I've experienced having dignity shown to me, and I've also had dignity within myself. And so, and going back to like the term, the buzzword, I think the word has to be used not as a shortcut, but actually it has to be applied. It has to be when you see someone whose moral standing is at stake, it's about getting involved. Dignity is not about sitting on the sideline and just watching some atrocity take place to other people. Dignity is about being intentional. It's about putting yourself in a situation to where you're uncomfortable because atrocities are taking place, not just in prison, they're all across this world. And dignity is the opposite of complacency. And I think the state of this country is in the place we're in because of complacency, because folks have looked and saw things and normalized certain behaviors, a lack of dignity in this society. And coming from someone that was in a place where dignity was not shown, dignity was the last word that you could ever think that you would experience inside of a prison cell. And then to come out into a world where I'm still fighting for dignity.
Jane, thank you. Greg.
Yeah, it's always hard following Greg. I think where it can become problematic is where the word is empty, is used in empty fashion or superficial. This is sad, but to be honest, I don't hear the term dignity used enough in the spaces I'm in. Mm-hmm. And yet, I think how Greg opened up in terms of the experiences of the lack of dignity, that's the spaces that we're in right now. Those are the spaces that we're in right now. But I don't see it as a term overused, such as like, in my spaces anyways, such as decolonize, right? Like all these terms that are kind of thrown around without understanding or sort of deep thought about what it means or doesn't mean, or, the implications or the history and so on and so forth. But for me, I think thinking about this word coming in, as I said at the very beginning, gave me space to kind of just be. And I thought that was really beautiful. So I think for me, I will bring this word in more often in different places, because I think as it did for me, what it can do is kind of cause pause. If you say a word that's lacking of the action that is lacking, then perhaps it would cause others in the room to pause and think, ooh, what if we recentered on dignity rather than the lack or absence of?
Mm-hmm. So your comments made me think of, and I'm going to ask you folks to wrap in a second, but just quickly as a side remark, the Indian caste system is by design it robs people of their dignity just upfront. It's designed to rob people. It's designed to prevent the assertion that some people have dignity, just outright. And yet, the word dignity hasn't really come up. So I'm just responding to Jane saying it needs to come up often enough in cultures across the world where we have rank. Actually, there's a long history of the word dignity being associated more with people of the higher rank, of the upper rank, or the dominant caste rank, where they can get to carry themselves with dignity, whereas the people called untouchables, unapproachables, unseeables. In fact, seeing a group of people is considered a sin for people in the dominant caste groups. That used to be the system. It's not that that's the system now, but we're still, in India, people still live with the vestige of the fact that there's this democratic fight back that's happened over the last 70 years. So there's a reclaiming going on. There are movements actually saying dignity is what we have already. It's the truth inside of us, but it is hard. to dismantle that system. So I feel, I heard you echo that in the point. So we have about 5 minutes. The one theme I see we are coming back to is that it's the whole complex person that we are, where dignity gets attacked or gets devalued when we start getting transactional, when we start disaggregating, when we undervalue and we unsee and so on and so forth. That's the sense I've got. So on this contest between the whole and also responsibility, because I think Shannon's point was good, because that's where the social part of it actually emerges. What are your closing thoughts? Take a minute each. We'll start with Irina.
Yeah, I've been thinking, especially after what Greg just said, I've been thinking about dignity as a word versus dignity as a practice or in practice. And what came to mind was Pope Francis washing the feet of people in prison, which was a very clear, through action, not words, assertion of those people's dignity, and a recognition that his doing that in no way diminished his own, right? Because we talk about the dignity of the role, of the position, and there were some people very upset that somebody in a position like the Pope's would do such a thing, as if that would diminish the dignity of his position or of himself as a human being. And I think for most of us in this room, I would guess, that actually heightened our sense of his own dignity, while, it helped us remember that all people have dignity, including the people whose feet he was washing with humility. So that's what aside from the fact that I want to use the word more in my own work, that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about now. What are those kind of actions that both uphold other people's dignity and really help us feel it more in ourselves as well?
Either of you. So I made a mistake here. I got 2 new cards and I didn't see them and I moved to closing. My apologies. I'm just going to read this out. If you can account for this in your closing thoughts. We've kind of gone over it, but this is an interesting one. We're living at a time when powerful people declare that others have no dignity. What in your experience has persuaded such people that the homeless, migrants and others in fact have dignity? What has actually worked? If you can account for that in what you were about to say magically in the moment, that would be good. Jane, you want to go first?
Yeah, my heart sunk there.
Greg looks at you like that. When Greg looks at you like that, I'm like, Jane, you want to go first?
I also want Greg to have the last word. It's hard because there are different conversations with different communities and every individual, that there's some people that may be open to having conversations and those who may not. I think those who may not. And so that would be really difficult. There are times that I've tried and there are times that I've been super exhausted and it's just been too hard. Even I think sometimes the dangerous places are even when there's well-intentioned efforts and it's just so hurtful. I'll give an example. I was in a suburb in Michigan not that long ago and literally just walking down the street, one of very few non-white folk in the area, and I got stopped, and it was just right from like my childhood experiences. Where are you from? Oh, I used to work in Japan. Well, actually, my parents just came to North Korea, but that's okay. There's an example of a well-meaning person who might want to have a conversation, but in that moment, I was tired. So how do you have the conversation? I think it's really boiling down to the true sort of real just conversations without kind of pinning people, just being open, but having trust and grace for fatigue and mistakes and for, just using the wrong words, but it's really built in, I think, relationality. I think that's something I think a lot about in terms of relationality. And I guess in terms of closing comments, I just wanted to say that in our organization, we're thinking a lot about a framework of how to respond to this moment. And a lot of movement builders are talking about these frameworks of like block and build or this and build. And we're using the terms defend and build. And in this time where we really feel like we have to defend our communities, not only in the violation of rights, know your rights, rapid response, so on and so forth. And in this place, I would say defending our dignity as well. There's also an opportunity based on hope, but based on possibility and based on our own experiences to build something better. And the build something better in terms of like dignity and all these other things is based on, I truly believe, in those collective spaces. It's in that classroom, in Jackie's classroom, where we can just share those experiences and have humanity for one another to build something that is more about peace than it is about dividing and conquering. That's more about our shared communities and our fractured communities. That's more about a future that many immigrants and refugees strive for, when to deep pains to get to flee oppression, to flee harm, to move towards an imagined peaceful future that hasn't yet been realized, but to take those knowledges, take those intentions, and come together and build together across divides, class, race, everything. And I think that really starts with relationality and, let's just say it, dignity for one another.
Thank you. You have the last word, Greg. You take a minute and then.
Thank you for that, Jane. Once again, I want to use a word that you just used, and I actually thought about this, and it's the word grace that you used, and I'll definitely want to introduce that as we close, because we know that dignity is about valuing yourself and valuing others, and grace is about showing or expressing that empathy and compassion for those values. And together, they come and form a connection that bonds human beings together. It creates a pathway for human beings to connect, to have love for one another, to have admiration for one another, and have respect for one another. And grace is something that we all deserve. We're born with these human rights of dignity and grace and love. These are things that are innate to us as human beings, and we cannot at any point strip that away from each other, and definitely we can't take it away from ourselves. So I encourage everyone to continue to have dignity, implement the word dignity, find a way to implement, be intentional about the way that you show up in your spaces with dignity in your prospective jobs and careers and your families, because dignity brings hope, and it creates a loving, caring world that we all want for our children and for us as a greater society.
Thank you. And on that note, I want to thank Jane, Greg, and Irina for being such wonderful panelists today on their journeys.
Thank you so much.